You're listening to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis, a podcast where thought leaders and clinical experts share their diverse insights and practical ideas for optimizing patient care. This series is hosted by Dr. Stephen R. Feldman, editor of the Journal of Dermatological Treatment and professor of dermatology at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Relevant disclosures can be found with the episode show notes on medscape.com or the Medscape app. The topics and discussions are planned, produced, and reviewed independently of advertisers. This podcast is intended only for U.S. healthcare professionals.
Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Feldman, and welcome to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis. This is the first episode of our fourth season. Adherence is one of those quiet forces in psoriasis care that can make or break even our best therapies. Today, I'm joined by the world's foremost expert on measuring patients' treatment adherence to talk about why sticking with treatment is so hard for patients and what the data really tell us about adherence in the real world. We're going to dig into where clinicians can intervene and how small changes can lead to better outcomes. Our guest is Chief Executive Officer and Scientific Lead of the Ardex Group, a global digital health company specializing in objective measurement and management of medication adherence. Our guest also serves as an invited professor of biostatistics at the University of Liège, Belgium, and is founding member and honorary past president of the International Society for Medication Adherence. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bernard Vrijens to In Discussion. Bernard, your work in adherence, I believe, deserves a Nobel Prize in medicine. I understand you got started with a PhD in applied mathematics and informatics. How did you get from there to focusing what I believe is like the most important issue we have in medicine for making patients well?
Thank you, Dr. Feldman. Thank you, Steve. I can accept the compliment on behalf of medication adherence because it's a long neglected worldwide problem of striking magnitude. And my PhD, in fact, was focused on the study of medication adherence and its input to pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic modeling. So it was really about new measures of medication adherence, modeling it, understanding its variability, and most importantly, understanding its consequences. And it felt to me like it was the highest impact problem I could work on. And after my PhD, I decided to join my mentor, who was John Urquhart, Professor John Urquhart, who was the Chief Scientific Officer of Ardex. And I thought this was the company where there was and still is the largest amount of exposure data worldwide. And that's why I joined Ardex in 2000.
Yeah, your point about it being neglect cannot be overstressed because I'm in dermatology and I don't think anybody talked about it here. I remember when I was in medical school, we used a book called Goodman and Gilman. Now, a lot of our younger listeners have never heard of books, but this thing was massive and it just had really thin sheets of paper. It described everything that would affect the variability in patients' treatment outcomes to a medication. You know, first pass metabolism, absorption, renal and fecal excretion. I don't remember that book saying anything about what I believe are the three most important factors that determine variation in individuals' response, which is number one, how well they take the medicine. Number two, how well they take the medicine. And number three, how well they take the medicine.
Yep.
So I was looking at the things you've written, and back in 1997, you wrote an article comparing compliance patterns between randomized treatments. Such randomized adherence interventions, I think, would be critical for developing actual practical tools to help patients take their medicine better. It looks like, is that the first paper that you did that focused on how to analyze the adherence data that were being collected?
Yes, that was the first time I had access to adherence data coming from electronic monitoring, from MEMS. It was a study in hypertension, trying to show that daily monitoring of blood pressure could improve medication adherence. But the point is that at that time, medication adherence was mistakenly considered as a percentage, 80% adherence or even worse, it was a dichotomy. You are adherent or you are not adherent. And the real value of electronic monitoring is that it's its richness. It provides a longitudinal, continuous flow of data that allows you to project exposure. And the ability to use the richness of those data, adherence is not a single point. Adherence are consecutive points. It's extremely rich and extremely valuable data that you can use for any statistical methods. And it was really exciting at that time. This was the beginning of generalized linear models for dichotomic outcomes. It was really an exciting topic, which is still today, but the methodology has advanced.
I remember papers that you and Dr. Urquhart wrote in that range, maybe, about 10 years ago, where you started to describe, maybe you'd already described, but you really formalized, I think, the taxonomy of adherence, how to describe the different behaviors. And I found that to, because like you say, I used to think, well, adherence is, what percentage of the time do patients take the medicine? But there's a much more rich way of looking at it.
So the taxonomy was a very important step for research in medication adherence. Now it's widely accepted. But the point is that at that time, about 10, 15 years ago, we did analyze thousands of patients' behavior, longitudinal behavior. So we knew exactly what it was. But we were also talking to many different stakeholders in the field: clinicians, health economists, pharma representatives, scientists in health behavior, for example. And I realized that behind the words adherence and compliance, we were talking about totally something different. And I can give you a few examples. For example, a healthcare provider, a physician, you see patients who already come back to your visit. So what you see primarily is how patients implement their dosing regimen on a day-by-day basis. The patients who will never initiate a treatment or will discontinue treatment typically disengage and they don't show up at the visits anymore. So when you are, as a clinician, talking about adherence, most of the time it is about how well they take their medications day by day. When a health economist is talking about adherence, he is looking at what proportion of patients discontinue treatment within 5 years. He uses typically pharmacy refill data, and it looks at discontinuation rates, non-persistence. And pharma representatives, they look at how many patients initiate their treatment, their new treatment. So all three are working on adherence, but one is focusing on the initiation of treatment. So after a first prescription, which treatment do you initiate, and if you initiate treatment, and when you initiate treatment? A very highly reflective period for the patients. Then you have after that how well they take their medications, once a day, twice a day, with food, without food, and think about the polymedicated patients. This implementation may be highly complex, and highly complex patients with whom healthcare providers have to deal with, polymedicated patients. And then health economists are more interested in persistence. And a lot of patients discontinue treatment after a while.
So we have an initiation phase. In the world of psoriasis, I think the best study on that was done in Denmark, where they have a national pharmacy database where they capture all the data. And for acne and infection prescriptions, about 10% of them were never even filled. I don't know I assume if they're filled, they're started, but that could be wrong too.
Yep.
For eczema, a third of the prescriptions were not filled. For psoriasis, half the prescriptions were not filled. It's just striking. I don't think there's any other area of economic behavior. Like, I mean, would you go to a car manufacturer and buy their car if half of them didn't work? I mean,
it's crazy. Yep.
It's crazy. And then the idea of quality of execution, how that varies over time, really interests me, because we have this phenomenon in dermatology called tachyphylaxis, and where you give patients medicines and they work at first, but then they gradually stop working. And I was taught that tachyphylaxis is the more you use the medicine, the less it works. Some theory that maybe you're down regulating the steroid receptors or something. But then the first time I put one of your caps on a container and started giving it to psoriasis patients, what we found was their use of medicine declines over time. So this tachyphylaxis phenomenon is not the more you use the medicine, the less it works. It's actually, not surprisingly, the less you use the medicine, the less it works. And until we had technology that would tell us what's happening on a day-to-day basis, we had no clue. We had all these terribly wrong ideas about what was happening with our patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you don't know, you cannot take the right decisions. And this is true in the medical space. But I would like also to stress the point that this is also true during the drug development process. And there are major mistakes, and we completely ignore them in drug development, leading often to inappropriate dosing and dosing regimens, and often set too high. And that's also an issue when you come with drugs that are inappropriately dosed through the drug development process and you come to medical practice. How do you manage adherence if the optimal is not 100% adherence but something in between? So the problem has to be tackled from the early drug development throughout the drug life cycle.
Yes, we have some oral agents for psoriasis in development now. We've had some revolutionary injection medicines, and one of the new orals works by the same mechanisms, blocking interleukin 23, as some of our best injection medicines. But the oral is not quite as effective as the injection medicines, even though it's blocking the same pathway. And I'm kind of convinced that what's happening is the adherence to the oral in the studies is not as good. And so you're not getting the pharmacological blockade that you would get with the injection medicine.
Yes, and it's a complex topic because injection meds are typically administered less frequently, every week, every other week, every month, or even less frequently. And so somewhere it improves adherence, it's easier to take, but any missed dose is more impactful.
Yes, we think about once a day dosing being better than twice a day dosing for adherence and all, but there is that downside that you're describing.
Yeah, exactly. And there is no not a generalization. It depends on the drug themselves. I did extensive work in the direct anticoagulants, for example. Half of them are twice daily, half of them are once daily. But the twice daily is much more forgiving for a missed dose.
Yes, because if you miss that once a day dose, you're going a long time and then your trough
Yep.
levels get too low.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I see issues in drug development at the moment with drugs that are, for example, administered once a month. What's typically when you develop a drug once a day, you would like your treatment to forgive a missed dose because missing a dose is a human behavior. It
Mm-hmm.
happens, it will happen. We are not robots, it will happen. But once you deal with once monthly treatments or once every other week treatment, how much forgiving do you want to build in? Probably you want the drug to be able to cover a few days delays, but do you want to forgive a missed dose? Probably not. And I see a lot of issues in drug development trying to have some forgiveness. But when you move to less frequent dosing, you have to think differently than when you developed oral drugs once a day or twice a day.
Yeah. And on top of that, I know from personal experience that if you miss a dose, some patients, me, are going to take two the next time and they may have potential toxicity from doing
Yeah.
that. All right. So we've covered a lot of the theory now. Let's talk about practical stuff. And I just love a paper that you were involved with, came out just this past year in a kidney journal.
Yeah.
10 tips to improve adherence. Now we get to the practical aspects. Let's talk about some of the critical things we can do. I think one of the first things you said was let's consider the causes of people's non-adherence. Tell me more about that.
I wanted to start by saying there is not a single solution to the adherence issue. So if somebody comes and say, I have an app, I have this, I have that, there is not a single solution. That's for sure. And also, I would say that fully adherent patients are really the exception, not the rule.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me just say you can recognize them because they're usually either a certified public accountant, an architect,
Yep.
an engineer, or anybody who brings you a multicolored Excel spreadsheet showing you everything they're doing.
And this is probably below the 7% of the population. It's about 5-ish% of the population who are really rigorous in how they take medications. And then I would say in clinical practice, we should take every opportunity to address the issue. And you don't need complex tools. Just ask the patients to describe in their own words how they take their medications. And very fast, you will see the patients who can say, yes, I wake up and my meds are next to my coffee, and that's how I take it. And the patients who really don't know, they cannot describe a habit. That's probably those patients who are at risk of being non-adherent.
Let me just raise another point about how I ask about this. If I have patients on a self injection medicine, I do not ask them, how do you take it? I ask them, what do you do with the extras syringes that you've accumulated? If they say, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't have any extras, okay, then they're taking it regular. If they say anything else, you know,
It's an excellent way. And I think the word adherence and compliance should not be in the questions. It's really a description of how they deal with practical issues, like exactly like you described. And then I think it's important to use the framework about initiation, implementation, and persistence, because those are very different aspects. And if you want to know if a patient is initiating a treatment while he is in a highly reflective motivation at the beginning, you should do that very differently if you want to still see if still taking the medication 10 years after the first prescription. Those are different aspects. And I would say measure. For example, you can use pharmacy refill rates to see if the patient interrupts treatment or discontinued treatment somewhere. If there is no acquisition of treatment anymore, that means he has stopped somewhere. And electronic monitoring could, for example, be used to measure precise implementation before switching to a more complex or a more expensive treatment. Very often, patients don't respond to a treatment because they are non adherent. And this very important step of switching may be a good point for electronic monitoring. But I would say, as I mentioned before, just address that issue at every consultation is the most important. And when you have identified an issue, then it's important to discuss potential causes and possible solutions on a case by case basis.
yeah. For our psoriasis patients, they have psoriasis in different areas. They may need different medicines, different vehicles. So if you have involvement in your scalp, you may prescribe a cortisone or a vitamin D solutions, possibly a foam, maybe a shampoo to use. For the face, genitals, which are sensitive areas, you might use a mild topical steroid along with some non-steroidal agent. For the elbows, you want to give them a really potent topical steroid, maybe an ointment, maybe along with some vitamin D analog or something, and maybe for the thin plaques on the body. I can remember being so happy when I learned that in the state that I practice in, I was allowed to write as many prescriptions as I want on a single sheet of paper. I'd only have to write the patient's name once and sign once. It was saving me so much time because I was writing 6 to 8 prescriptions for people. And now I'm thinking, you can't get patients to do one thing well. This is absurd.
Yeah.
Have you studied what happens when you give people 2 or 3 different things to do at once?
We did study polymedication, and the most important problem is when they have to do it at different time points.
Aha.
And for example, this is just increasing the opportunities of non-adherence. If, especially, and I'm talking also, for example, in cardiovascular, typically the physician will prescribe your antihypertensive medication in the morning and your statin in the evening. Those are two occasions of being non-adherent. So
Yeah.
bringing it together is easier. So yes, clearly simplifying the dosing regimen and simplifying the treatments is an important point. It helps a lot.
A couple things I think are really dumb about the way medicine is set up. The pills often come in these beige bottles that are designed to blend into the natural environment so you don't even notice them. I think birth control pills proved that every pill should come in a blister pack telling you what pill to take what day.
I'm coming from Europe, I'm from Belgium, and we do have blister packs. However, the way they are designed and the days of the week written on blister packs in Europe are very poorly designed. So there is a huge improvement in how we can deliver medications to patients with simple tools to help them.
Triggers, I think, are underappreciated. These you mentioned in your paper links to daily habits. I remember I could not remember to put my antifungal cream on my toes until I learned to keep the cream on top of my socks in the drawer. That one little tiny change totally changed my ability to remember to put the medication on.
Yep. Building habits and good cues is critical to move from a reflective motivation to an automatic motivation. Building habit is really important. And the problem I see today, if you Google about medication adherence solutions, they all come with time based reminders. They try to remind you at 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever the time you can define. But as we said before, only 5% of the population takes the medication at a specific time. The remaining, the 93% of the population, they are event based. They take their medications with another event, with another trigger. When they get up, when they take the first breakfast, the first coffee, they take their socks or whatever. But it's event based. And you cannot solve that. They have to find their own habit, but measuring and feedback is the way to check habits and build habits.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think industry has proven that if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. The last topic I wanted to discuss with you was peer support because I believe this is maybe the single most important thing, the secret sauce for getting humans to do things. And I like to think about it like piano lessons. My kids took piano lessons. So the teacher gave them some sheet music, said, practice this every day. We're going to have a lesson once a week. There'll be a recital in 3 months. And everybody sounded pretty good because they're practicing some every week. Imagine what would happen if a piano teacher said, well, that's inefficient. The reason they sound good is not the weekly lessons, it's because they're practicing every day. I'll just give them the sheet music, tell them to practice every day, see them at the recital in 3 months. Well, nobody's going to practice until 3 days before the recital.
Yep.
The first one is like a drug study where they bring patients back at weeks 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, and they show you this beautiful curve. Those visits make people use the medicine the way people floss their teeth right before they go to the dentist. Doctors are actually worse than the piano teacher who doesn't have those weekly visits. It's doctors are like a piano teacher says, here's a prescription for some sheet music. Take it to the sheet music store. I have no idea how much it's going to cost. I want you to practice this sheet music every day. Practicing this sheet music may cause rashes, diarrhea, possibly a serious infection. We're not going to have weekly lessons. I'll just see you at the recital in 3 months. And if the recital doesn't sound good, which it often doesn't, I'm going to give you a second and possibly third musical instrument to practice at the same time. Social influences seem to me to be critical for getting people to do things. I think the weight management people know this because they put people into groups and they weigh them together. And so there's both the measurement and the social connections driving people to stay on their weight programs.
Absolutely. And peer support, I have been involved in different programs with peer support. Going from very traditional peer support in communities in HIV, for example, which
Yes.
have been extremely, extremely efficacious. People gathering together to prepare their monthly medication tracks,
Uh
every
huh.
month or every week in communities to prepare and engage together. So I've seen that working extremely well. I have seen some digital solutions trying to develop peer support that have failed. For example, I've seen a game, a very well developed game, where the peer support was the grandchildren gaming, and the grandparents taking their meds would
Wow.
generate points for the children. So it was extremely well designed,
Uh-huh.
but didn't work at all at the end, because not everybody has grandchildren, and so sometimes it's over engineered. But I think peer support, when appropriate, can be a huge help. We see also a major difference in adherence between couples and single person, and it's higher when the husband or the wife is taking care of the partner. We do see better adherence. This is peer support as well, but this doesn't exist always. So it's still case by case. It can be extremely useful when it's appropriate.
Yeah, that's super. I think humans are so unpredictable. You can't predict what an adherence intervention is going to do until you actually measure. And gosh, it even reminds me, gosh, of what you're saying about two parents. I remember there was some stuff with pediatric leukemia where two parent households did worse than one parent households because you knew which parent was responsible in the one parent household. All right. Well, today we talked to Dr. Bernard Vrijens about the role adherence plays in the treatment of psoriasis. Adherence can be bad. We can't fix it if we don't measure it. Asking patients to report their adherence isn't particularly accurate, but the technology that Bernard's been involved with, electronic monitoring, gives us a foundation, a way to objectively measure adherence to improve our patients' treatment outcomes. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Dr. Stephen Feldman for In Discussion.
Thanks for listening to Medscape's In Discussion Psoriasis podcast series with our host, Dr. Stephen R. Feldman. Be sure to look for more In Discussion episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Check out medscape.com or the Medscape app for show notes, links, and more information on psoriasis.